Hello, my name is Daryl Robert Schoon, and for this session of Dollars and Cents, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, gold. Now, most people don't understand gold, at least in the way it is in play today. We have notions about gold, that it's valuable, that it has always been valuable, and that rich people have it and poor people don't. And now there's all this talk about gold as money or whatever that is, and it's a lot of background noise. But I want to approach the subject from another vantage point. Now, let's say wheat. Everybody, we eat wheat in this country, except for you celiacs out there. We can't do it anymore. But before you were celiacs, you ate wheat too, along with the rest of us. Now, let's say this is a staple in our diet, okay? I want you to consider what would happen if all of a sudden the wheat harvest started running short by 25% a year. All right? Now, what would happen is, for the first few years, we would get by drawing down the wheat reserves that we've got. There are reserves all around the world of grains, soybeans, wheat, et cetera, all right? In case of shortages, market shortages. These are buffer crops, all right? And if all of a sudden the wheat harvest dropped by 25% next year, that's a huge drop. We would probably deplete those wheat reserves within 1 year, all right? Now, let's say this harvest drop was caused by drought, all right? Record drought. And the next year, we had more drought. Same, no rain. And wheat harvest again fell by 25%. Well, the difference this year is that we don't have the reserves to back us up. All right? The reserves, the warehouses that were holding our grain reserves had now been depleted. And now we have the same demand, the same need for that wheat all over the world, with only 75% of what it would take to fulfill those needs. Well, what would happen is the price of wheat would skyrocket. It would skyrocket. All right? And let's say the next year the same thing happened, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year, and the next year. Well, after 5 to 10 years, we'd have starvation. The poor countries would be on the ropes. We would have social unrest. All right? And that's what would happen, among other things, if we had something as drastic as that happening. Well, I want to tell you something. For the past 20 years or so, the demand for gold has been at least 25% larger than the amount of gold mined. All right? The amount of gold mined. Now, for the first at least 10 years of that shortage, the price of gold did not go up. All right? The worldwide demand for gold is probably around 5,000 metric tons. The mining of gold during that time was probably 3,500 metric tons. There have been no major gold discoveries made for decades. The South African mines were the largest discoveries made. It was sort of like the Saudi oil fields. All right? And before then you had the Texas oil fields. The largest gold mine before that time was probably in the United States, Homestake Mining, up in where is it, South Dakota, which was on Indian land, given to the Indians until we discovered gold. And we became Indian givers and took the land back and kicked the Indians off. But that was the largest gold mine before the South African gold mines came on. All right? But now, what I want to say is, for much of that time, you had an annual mine production of approximately 3,500 metric tons a year. You had a market demand of 5,000 tons per year. All right? Like the metaphor about grain, once your supplies are depleted, prices are going to rise. So it's clear that they have been depleted. They haven't been depleted because prices are barely, they started rising 10 years ago. But for the first 10 to 15 years, when we had shortages, prices fell. Prices fell. Which means is not only were you working off of supplies, Somebody was pouring more supplies into the market and forcing the price of gold lower. Now, why would anyone do this? Why would anybody want to force the price of gold lower? Well, Paul Volcker in the early 1980s said, after gold had shot up to $850 an ounce, one of my regrets is we didn't learn to manage gold sooner. Why was the chairman of the Federal Reserve saying that? Why his regret was not learning soon enough to manage gold. In other words, to keep its price lower and lower and lower. All right? This is because after the United States went off the gold standard in 1971, that piece of paper that you consider money became just that, a piece of paper. No one, not even other countries, could take this to the Treasury and get $35, pay $35 of paper coupons and get an ounce of gold, which they were able to do in 1970. In 1971, with us $35 in coupons, they couldn't do that anymore. All right? So this is what happened. In 1971, when Nixon closed the gold window, for the first time in the history of the world, gold was no longer money. Gold was money before in the sense that it backed the currencies of the world. Everybody used paper, but those papers were ultimately convertible at some point down the line into gold. All right? Because you'd be a fool to work for somebody for a piece of paper, for an IOU. You'd be a fool to sell them your oil for a piece of paper, for an IOU. You'd be a fool. In the 1700s, the British tried to pull this on the Chinese. The British were the first people to come out with gold-backed paper money, allegedly gold-backed. All right? It wasn't never fully gold-backed. It was just enough gold-backed to get them to the door. All right? And it worked in England. But when they tried to take their dog and pony act on the road to China in the 1700s, and the British, they loved Chinese silks. They had a lot of money. The British loved Chinese porcelain. They drank a lot of tea. The British loved the goods that China had. And the Chinese, they didn't care about English woolens. They didn't care about whatever the British made. All right? So if the British wanted those Chinese teas and porcelains and silks, the Chinese said, give us silver. Pay us. And the British said, oh no, we have these monies, these pieces of paper. This is what we use. And the Chinese go, hey, we want silver. So the British had to go with that silver, buy millions of dollars worth of silver at that time, because they used a lot of tea, a lot of silk, and a lot of porcelain from China, and paid this to the Chinese to get what they wanted. And the British didn't like this. So in 1745, the British started the first of two opium wars, which forced the Chinese to accept opium manufactured in British India in return for their goods. This is how the British balanced their payment of trade. All right? So the first attempt to not accept that piece of paper was wiped out and obliterated by the British Navy. Okay? Now, right now, the Saudis are pumping all this oil to the West and getting paid in pieces of paper. The Chinese are the world's largest sweatshop, manufacturing everything from semiconductors to cars to whatever they're doing, air conditioning units, selling them to the rest of the world at cheaper than the rest of the world can manufacture themselves. And they're getting the same pieces of paper that they refused to take from the British 250 years before. The British banking system now dominates the world. All right? They now dominate the world. And they did this because they could print pieces of paper, pass them off as money, and they did this as long as they can convince the other people that these pieces of paper were as good as gold or could be somehow exchanged for gold somewhere down the line. In 1970, the charade stopped. The facade stopped. It's because the United States ran out of gold, was running out of gold. We had spent so much on the military around the world between 1950 and 1970 that we knew we had basically trillions of dollars of paper money out there that they were going to someday come to us and ask to be exchanged at $35 each and get an ounce of gold. And we used to have a lot of gold. We used to have so much gold that we backed the whole world's currency system. But in the 20 years, the United States spent so much on military around the world in foreign countries that we couldn't back that paper anymore. And so we went off the gold standard. All right? Now what happened is, all of a sudden, for the first time in the history of the world, gold was not a part of the monetary component, nor was silver. Now I want you to understand how important this is. This is like saying, for the first time in the history of the world, oxygen disappeared. Wow, that would be something, wouldn't it? Oxygen disappeared. Or for the first time in the world, it stopped raining. Wow. I mean, this wasn't something that people got around and thought up. This was something that over centuries people trusted gold and silver and would only give what they made or had as valuable for something of value. All right? Now, what happened is the British started the charade because of the advantage that it gave them. They were able to do this charade, pass off their pieces of paper, and not even necessarily pass it off in place of gold and silver to get you to sell them or give them their goods and services for their pieces of paper. They did this because every piece of paper issued out of their bank came in the form of a loan. They did this to indebt you. They did this to indebt the government of England. They did this to indebt everybody who used their pieces of paper. In central banking, started by the Bank of England, every piece of paper, every piece of money is issued in the form of debt. They do this to indebt you. Now, I want to tell you how successful they have become. Who among you is not indebted? The difference is some of you can still pay your debts, and there are those of you who can't. That's the only difference. We now think this is normal and natural. It's like breathing through a straw. Maybe in the beginning, only a few people were breathing through straws, and after 20 years, everybody's breathing through a straw. And we walk around and, hey, you got a straw sticking out of your nose, I got a straw sticking out of mine. What's the diff? Before central banking, debt was very, very dangerous. They would only do it when necessary. And they carried it, and sometimes it was necessary. Sometimes it gave you the leverage to do great things. But it was always something that you treated like my metaphor about steroids again. You treated it like steroids, something to be used in an emergency. And like the metaphor of steroids, you've been on steroids for decades now. There are consequences. You can't undo decades of excessive steroid use. By going off of it, you might die. And that's the same thing with debt. The bankers did this. The bankers passed you that little piece of paper. And only Britain did it before. Then it came to the United States. And because we did it, everybody started doing it. All right? And this is where the world is at now. This is what happened when gold was removed from the backing. It didn't change the piece of paper. The piece of paper looked the same. What happened is, all of a sudden, the governments could print a lot more of that paper than they did before. And not just the United States, but everyone went to the races. The difference was, when we stopped exchanging our pieces of paper for gold, by that time, we were the gold standard for the world. The saying, good as gold, applied to the dollar. The mafia in Russia would take US dollars over Russian rubles. All right? I mean, because they knew it had value. All right? This is what the confidence of a gold-backed currency did. What happened is, when they no longer would convert the pieces of paper to gold, that went, but the confidence stayed. Because you were already used to passing around these pieces of paper of money like gold. You were already used to breathing through straws. Nothing disturbs you about it. What you didn't know was what was going to happen once they did that. That event happened in 1971. We are now 40 years down the road. I have heard that the average life of a purely fiat currency is 40 years. Now, that might mean that this is the last year we're going to get through this door, that some very bad things are going to happen. Because when currencies become worthless, what that means is your money is no longer acceptable. All right? It's no longer acceptable. Now, I want to tell you something. The rest of the world is scrambling to get out of US dollars, but they don't know what else to do. The euro is no better than the dollar. The euro did not come in as a device to replace a fiat currency. The euro came in when the Europeans thought, my God, the Americans are getting away with murder, let's get in on it too. And they put their currency together in such a haphazard fashion that people at the time, and I'm very well aware of what some monetary experts said was going to happen to the euro if they put it out like the way they did. But they did. And now 10 years later, the euro is on its last legs. Europe is at the ropes, and everybody's going, what happened? Well, I've read the warnings. I've read what people said 10 years ago would happen if they put out the euro on that basis. But the euro was never going to save the world from a fiat US dollar anyway. And the Chinese yuan is another worthless piece of paper. The Chinese even have less gold backing their currency than we do. And if we didn't create a problem after the dot-com bubble burst and we reinflated a real estate bubble to reinvigorate economy, I want to tell you what happened to China after the bubble collapsed all around the world in 2007, 2008. The Chinese created a real estate bubble, which is about to collapse. And when their bubble collapses, it's going to take down the world just like when the US real estate bubble took down the world. This is what happens when they took gold out of the game. Because until 1970, gold was a constraint. You can't manufacture gold out of thin air. Gold is always valuable. You can't spend more gold than you have without borrowing something from somebody. But the bankers created a system where gold was the foundation of their system of loaning pieces of paper. And when they could no longer redeem those pieces of paper for gold, they just kept printing those pieces of paper. They didn't know what to do. I know the bankers were upset when they found out the United States had spent all its damn gold and they couldn't redeem those pieces of paper anymore. The bankers were thinking that the United States had its act together and wouldn't blow their currency apart. The British had kept that currency together for 250 years. The Americans were given the golden goose and killed it within 70. The only thing remains within 60 years. The only thing we're waiting for is the goose to die. You know that what happens on a farm when you chop off the head of a chicken and the chicken keeps walking around with blood pouring out of it until it falls over? Well, I want to tell you something. In 1970, they chopped off the head of the goose, the golden goose, or the chicken. And that animal has been wandering around for 40 years, albeit in bigger and bigger circles, all right? And that blood has been pouring out. That animal is about to fall over. This is what happened. Now, this is history. Just like you cannot go back and undo your steroid use, we cannot go back and say, oops, we spent too much money, we're not going to pay it back. Now, you can do that. In fact, Greece is having to do it now. The United States is going to have to do it in the future. Every country is going to have to do it. The only country that has more money that it doesn't have to pay back is China, basically. And China, what its wealth is tied up in is other countries' IOUs. Their wealth, $1.5 trillion of their assets are U.S. I'll pay you back sometime. They're the only country with more IOUs than IOUs themselves. This is where we're at now. You cannot go back to where you were. It's like a heroin addict waking up and realizing, oh my God, I'm strung on heroin. Well, that's a wonderful insight, Fred. I told you should have gone to counseling 30 years ago when you started chipping away. Oh my God, I regret it. What can I do? Well, like the heroin addict, the more you've borrowed, the worse the come down is. All right? Why can't we just go and say, listen, why don't we just call it quits? Let's start clean. I promise to be a good boy, and I'm not going to do it again. Because what those obligations and IOUs have been sold to, They've been sold to insurance companies. They've been sold to insurance companies. That's where your pensions are. That's where your pensions are. You went, gave your money to insurance companies that took your money and went and bought IOUs. All right? And they thought these IOUs are going to, as long as you kept paying, they were going to give you your pension. The moment you stopped paying, they didn't have to pay you. They didn't care how much you put, they could stop paying you. That's it. All right? But the truth is, it was dependent, your being paid back was not only dependent on them paying back, what you're being paid back was really dependent upon them being paid back. 3 years ago, it was believed that sovereign debt was the safest debt in Europe. Who owned most of the debt in Europe? Of countries like Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, Ireland? The banks. The banks loved sovereign debt because taxes were going to pay them back. They had to pay you back because banks needed to borrow money to keep going. So all these countries were rated AAA. You know what AAA means? That means your credit is good to go. The same thing as the AAA mortgage that were sold in the United States in 2002 to 2006. They're good until they're not good. They're great until they're not great. All right? What happened is those banks now in Europe are holding massive amounts of sovereign debt of countries that are going to default. When they talk about saving Greece, I want to tell you something. They don't give a damn about Greece. They're talking about saving the banks that loaned the Greeks money. That's who they're trying to save. Now, if those banks go down, what's going to happen to the insurance companies? They're all in the same pool. We're all in the pool of called IOU. IOU. Now, I may owe you, but I can only pay you if who owes me pays me. We are in a daisy chain of debt. And you all know that the weakest link in the chain determines what happens to the chain. I didn't destroy the housing market in the United States. It was when the guy who made $11.25 an hour couldn't pay off his $500,000 mortgage 2 years later. He was the weakest link in the chain. And it affected the banks that loaned him the money. It affected the people who had the insurance with AIG. It affected countries. All it takes is the weakest link to crack, the whole chain goes down. We are in a daisy chain of debt. This is why gold was so important. This is why gold will be important, but is not now today. Gold is important only as a device for you to park your assets in until their paper assets go to zero. And then, let me tell you, you'll be able to buy the world for pennies on a dollar. But right now, we are in that point where all the IOUs are starting to go. And it may be down the road, but it's like a fuse. Once it's been lit and you're on that fuse, it's going to get to you. So I was going to try and be a little more optimistic. And I am. I mean, it would take me to be heavily medicated to be as happy as I am. And it's not because I have gold and silver. It's because I know a better world is coming. I know that the financial collapse is only part of a greater cosmicity, a greater shifting of balances in the universe itself. A greater event is taking place. The collapse of financial markets is only part and parcel of this great shift that is going on. And if I didn't believe that that shift is positive, if I didn't believe a better world is coming, I would be on medication. And I would need that medication. And I know many of you are on medication. And I know you think you need that medication. But with gold, silver, and with my great friend Reverend Betty Tadaleski says, breathing deeply, you can get through it. And so, my friends, as we head off into the future, I wish you the best. Daryl Roberts.